Hello? Tonight, we open an old case file, but one that has never rested. Our first piece of evidence is Exhibit A. It's a small, exquisite object resting under the sterile lights of a museum gallery. A cat mummy. Its linen wrappings are impossibly intricate, laid in precise geometric patterns. Its face is often covered with a gilded, serene mask, or the details of its eyes and whiskers are painted on with delicate care. The story this object tells is one of love. This must be a cherished family pet, a companion so beloved that its owners spent a fortune to mummify it, just as they would a human, to ensure its journey into the afterlife. This is the image Egypt has sold us, and for 2,000 years we have bought it. But this exhibit is a profound misdirection. It is a lie of sentiment. The truth is not in the single, perfect specimen under glass. The truth is underground, in the dark, stretching for miles. It's in the sheer, suffocating quantity. This wasn't a cottage industry of love. It was an industrial-scale operation of sacrifice, a supply chain for the gods that produced mummies by the tens of millions. And you may not want to be there when the truth surfaces. Before we continue, please like and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy this investigative storytelling style. Tonight's file is on the 70 million mummies. What are your hypotheses? Why would a civilization dedicate such vast resources to this? Dim the lights, open your skeptical eyes, and enter the case file. The common fact, the one we all learn in school, is that the ancient Egyptians revered animals. This is true. They saw the gods in the creatures around them. The jackal was Anubis, the falcon was Horus, the crocodile was Sobek, and of course, the cat was the living embodiment of the goddess Bastet. Herodotus, the Greek historian, famously wrote that if a house caught fire, the Egyptians would rush to save their cats before saving themselves. He claimed the penalty for killing a cat, even by accident, was death. This evidence all points to a nation of animal lovers reinforcing our beloved pet theory. This theory explains some animal burials, but it completely and totally collapses in the face of the archaeological reality. This is where the case file opens. We are not talking about a few thousand revered pets buried over 3,000 years. We are talking about an explosion of animal mummification, a fever that gripped Egypt, primarily in its later periods, from around 600 BC onwards. This is the odd, lesser-known detail, the sheer industrial scale. We have discovered vast, sprawling underground necropolises, cities of the dead, dedicated only to animals. At Saqqara, the burial ground for Memphis, excavators found a catacomb containing an estimated 1.8 million mummified ibis, and another catacomb complex for falcons. At Tuna El Gabel, a labyrinthine network of tunnels stretches for miles, packed floor to ceiling with millions more ibis and baboons, offerings to the god Thoth. At Bubastis, the center of the cat cult, a staggering cat cemetery was unearthed. The number is almost incomprehensible. An estimated 70 million animal mummies were produced and buried in these ritual sites. This was not love. This was commerce. These were not pets. They were votive offerings. An average Egyptian seeking a favor from a god wouldn't just light a candle or say a prayer. They would go to a temple and buy an offering. And the offering the gods demanded was one of their own sacred animals, mummified and delivered. This was a massive, vertically integrated industry. Historians still debate whether this entire system was driven by a genuine, bottom-up explosion of popular piety, a desperate need by the common people to connect with their gods in a tangible way. Or if it was a cynical, top-down, profit-driven enterprise managed by the temples. Was this faith, or was this a brilliantly marketed fraud? The evidence we've found inside these millions of bundles is what makes this a true criminal investigation. That beautiful gilded cat in the museum? It's not a pet. It's a product. And this case file is about to look inside the factory. That gilded cat was a product, and the temples were the factory. But this was a factory with a guaranteed market because the products weren't a luxury. They were a theological necessity. The common fact, one that every Egyptologist agrees on, is that the animal cults were a core part of Egyptian religion, especially in the late period. The gods were not just abstract concepts in the sky. They had physical, earthly forms. Their BA, or essence, could inhabit a specific animal. This is the theological engine that drove the entire sacrificial industry. You didn't just pray to Bastet. You prayed through a cat, her living incarnation on earth. When you needed wisdom from Thoth, the god of writing, you sought it through his sacred animals, the ibis and the baboon. The falcon was the avatar of Horus, the crocodile was the terrifying vessel of Sobek, and the jackal was the manifestation of Anubis, the embalmer god himself. This wasn't just symbolism. To the average Egyptian, that ibis was a living piece of thought. This belief system created a new, massive, and highly profitable religious economy. And this is the odd, lesser-known detail that this case file is built upon. This wasn't just worship. It was a pilgrimage industry. Here's how the business model worked. A pilgrim, a farmer, a soldier, a merchant, had a problem. Perhaps his wife was infertile, or he was facing a lawsuit, or his child was sick. A local priest would advise him to make a petition to the relevant god. To do this, the pilgrim would travel, perhaps hundreds of miles, to the god's main cult center, to Bubastis for Bastet, or to Saqqara, the great necropolis that housed the cults of Thoth, Anubis, and many others. Once there, the pilgrim did not just pray. He entered a massive temple complex, a marketplace of faith. And there, from the temple priests, he would purchase a votive offering, the product. He would buy a pre-mummified cat, or a pre-mummified ibis, or a pre-mummified falcon. This was his prayer made tangible. It was a physical message, a sacrifice to prove his piety. The pilgrim would hand over his silver, and the priest would take the mummy and promise to deliver it to the god, interring it in the sacred dark catacombs connected to the temple. Now, multiply this transaction by millions. Millions of people over hundreds of years, all seeking divine favor. This created an insatiable, year-round demand for sacred animal mummies. The temples, which controlled the cult centers, now controlled the entire supply chain. They were the manufacturers, the distributors, and the sole authorized retailers. They had a perfect monopoly on salvation. Historians still debate whether the priests who masterminded this enterprise were devout servants merely fulfilling a sacred obligation, or if they were the most cynical marketing executives in the ancient world. Did they truly believe every one of the millions of ibis they sold was a divine soul? Or did they see a market opportunity, a way to monetize piety by creating an artificial scarcity of a product they could, in fact, mass produce? The logistics of this are staggering. You cannot fulfill an order for millions of ibis mummies by simply hoping to find enough wild birds in the marshes. You cannot meet the daily demand for sacred cats by waiting for strays to wander in. This level of demand required a solution. It required a factory. And the archaeological evidence, hidden just beneath the sand, shows us exactly what that factory looked like. The business model we uncovered in Section 2, a pilgrimage economy built on selling salvation, was a logistical nightmare. The demand was in the millions. The supply, if left to nature, was finite. You simply cannot trap 1.8 million wild ibis at Saqqara without exterminating the entire species. The temples, run by the most organized bureaucrats in the ancient world, would never leave their most profitable enterprise to chance. They needed to control the means of production. They didn't just need a factory to process the animals. They needed a factory to create them. The common fact is that the great temples of Egypt were not just religious centers. They were colossal economic engines. They owned vast tracts of farmland, employed thousands of people, and ran massive workshops. This is accepted. We've long known they managed cattle herds for food sacrifices. But this was something else. This was a secret parallel agriculture. This is where the forensic investigation begins, and it reveals the odd, lesser-known detail that forms the backbone of this case: the sacred breeding farm. The temples weren't just harvesting animals from the wild, they were farming them. On an industrial state-sanctioned scale, they were breeding millions of animals for the specific sole purpose of being killed, mummified, and sold. Our evidence for this is no longer circumstantial. It comes from inside the mummies themselves. When researchers at the University of Manchester and elsewhere began to CT scan and digitally unwrap these animal mummies, they didn't just look at the skeletons, they looked at the stomach contents. The ibis, for example, revealed a last meal, not a varied, wild-caught fish and insects, but a homogeneous diet. In some cases, the birds had been force-fed, a practice known as gavage, identical to how the Egyptians fattened geese for the dinner table. They were being fattened for the gods. The skeletal evidence is even more damning. X-rays of cat mummies show a chilling consistency. A huge percentage of them are not old, beloved pets who died of natural causes. They are young, healthy cats, all killed at a specific, market-ready age, between 2 and 4 months old. The cause of death is often identical: a sharp, deliberate break of the cervical vertebrae. Their necks were wrung. This is not love. This is animal husbandry. The same applies to the ibis. Analysis of the bones suggests they were not raised in the wild marshes of the Nile Delta. Isotopic signatures in their skeletons point to a localized, non-wild diet. Archaeologists excavating the areas around the great catacombs, like the one at Saqqara, have found the physical remains of these breeding farms, vast enclosures, pens, and evidence of industrial-scale snail farming, the snails being the primary food source for the farmed ibis. Historians still debate whether the average pilgrim had any idea this was happening. When a farmer bought a sacred ibis, did he believe he was offering a divine creature, a piece of Thoth's soul captured from the wild? Or was it an open secret that this was just a sacred-born ibis, a representative, like buying a candle from a church shop today? The priests, it seems, were happy to blur the line. They were not just priests, they were breeders, ranchers, and farmers, managing a sacred production line that began in a muddy enclosed pen and ended in the darkness of the catacomb. They had solved the supply problem. Now they had to solve the production problem. How to turn millions of fresh carcasses into millions of sacred mummies, quickly and profitably. The temples had solved their supply crisis. The sacred breeding farms we identified in Section 3 were producing a steady, predictable supply of carcasses. Young cats, ibis, falcons, and crocodiles, all raised for one purpose. But this created a new bottleneck in the production line. The common fact we all associate with mummification is the one used for pharaohs like Tutankhamun, a painstaking 70-day ritual. It involved the removal of internal organs into canopic jars, the drying of the body in natron salt for 40 days, and the anointing of the body with priceless resins, all before being wrapped in hundreds of yards of the finest linen. This was an artisanal process, bespoke and astronomically expensive. It was also completely impossible to apply to an industrial-scale operation. You cannot run a 70-day process on 1.8 million ibis. The temples needed a new method. They needed mummification, but they needed it fast, cheap, and scalable. This is where the case file uncovers the odd, lesser-known detail. The embalmer's workshop for animals was not a sacred space. It was a factory floor. The techniques used were a brutal, cost-effective, mass-production version of the real thing. Let's look at the forensic evidence from the CT scans and X-rays. For a human mummy, the brain was painstakingly removed through the nose with a long hook, a delicate, skilled procedure. For the animal mummies, the brain was often just left in. For a pharaoh, the internal organs were carefully harvested and preserved. For the animal mummies, the body was often just dipped whole into a vat of molten resin or bitumen. This quick dip method would kill bacteria and harden the animal, but it was a crude approximation of true preservation. In other cases, the animal was simply dried out in the sun without even the expensive natron salt before being wrapped. The wrapping itself tells the story. For a pharaoh, the wrapping was an intimate, sacred act. For the animals, it was an assembly line. The quality of the linen is often coarse, and the wrapping style is hurried. But this is where the genius of the enterprise comes in. The exterior of the mummy, the part the pilgrim would actually see in the temple shop, was often exquisite. This is the great disconnect, the beloved pet illusion from Section 1. The priests poured all their resources into the packaging. The linen would be arranged in intricate, beautiful geometric patterns. A cheap, bitumen-dipped cat carcass would be placed inside a custom painted sarcophagus. A simple ibis bundle would have a skillfully molded clay head, painted to look lifelike. It was the ultimate triumph of marketing. The product itself was cheap, but the presentation was priceless. It looked like a sacred artisanal object, worthy of the gods. It was only when you looked inside that you saw the cost cutting. Historians still debate whether this was a sacred act of down-market piety or a cynical deception. When an embalmer quickly dipped a dead cat in tar, did he see himself as performing a holy rite, making the sacred accessible to the common man? Or was he a factory worker, cutting corners to meet a daily quota, knowing full well the customer would never see beyond the fancy wrapping? The evidence suggests a system under immense pressure, one that prioritized quantity over quality and appearance over substance. They had solved supply and production, but as the demand continued to grow, even this hurried system began to crack. leading to the case file's most shocking discovery, a fraud that went to the very heart of the product itself. We have now established a factory running at full capacity. We have the sacred breeding farms for supply, as detailed in Section 3, and the hurried cost-cutting embalming workshops from Section 4. The entire enterprise was a triumph of logistics, designed to meet an insatiable demand. But what happens to any factory in any era when demand outstrips supply? When the quotas are impossible, the production line starts to cheat. The common fact that underpins all mummification for humans and animals is that it was a sacred act of preservation. The entire theological purpose was to keep the physical form of the deceased intact, a permanent vessel for the soul, or bay, to inhabit in the afterlife. The body had to be there. This was the fundamental promise of the entire ritual. This is the promise the priests, it seems, were willing to break. We now submit our central piece of evidence, Exhibit C, the high-resolution CT scanner. For over a century, museums have held these millions of votive mummies, these beautifully wrapped bundles, and cataloged them based on their exterior. That, we assumed, was a cat. This, an ibis. But in the last 2 decades, non-invasive technology has allowed us to digitally unwrap them, to peer through the linen and see what lies beneath. The results of this large-scale forensic analysis are the single most shocking discovery of this case file. This is the odd, lesser-known detail. A staggering percentage of these mummies are fakes. A comprehensive study by the Manchester Museum, which scanned over 800 animal mummies from its collection, revealed a statistic that is hard to comprehend. Roughly 1/3 of them were fakes in some way. A second, parallel study of a different collection found the number to be closer to 1/2. We are not talking about minor imperfections. We are talking about deliberate systemic fraud. The investigation identifies 3 distinct types of counterfeit. First, there is the partial. The bundle is the correct shape and size. It feels authentic, but the scan reveals it contains only a single fragment, a cat skull, an ibis leg, a few feathers, or a random piece of animal bone. The rest of the bundle's bulk is made up of padding, bundled reeds, scrap linen, mud, and even bird droppings, all carefully wrapped to create the illusion of a complete animal. Second, there is the composite. The wrappings are exquisite, but inside, the scanner reveals a jumbled, chaotic mass of bones from multiple different animals, none of them complete. It is the refuse from the embalmer's workshop floor, swept up, packaged, and sold as a pristine single offering. Third, and most cynical of all, is the true fake. The linen wrap is immaculate, a geometric masterpiece. It might even have a gilded mask, the very object that gave us the beloved pet illusion from Section 1. But inside, the scan reveals nothing. No animal at all, just a bundle of mud, sticks, and reeds, carefully shaped to look like a cat or a falcon, then wrapped as the genuine article. Historians still debate whether this was a cynical, profit-driven scam or a form of pious substitution that everyone, including the customer, tacitly understood. Was the priest at Bubastis a con man, taking a farmer's life savings and handing him a bundle of mud? Or was the physical animal itself not the point? Perhaps the act of sacrifice, the intention of the pilgrim, was what mattered. In this view, maybe the priest would bless the bundle of reeds, and that blessing made it a valid offering. Perhaps the pilgrim knew he was only buying a token mummy, a symbolic sacrifice, and that was all he could afford. The evidence is ambiguous, but the sheer scale of the deception suggests an industry under immense pressure, cutting corners at every possible stage to maximize profit. We are no longer just investigating a religion. We are investigating a potential multi-million mummy fraud. The evidence is now stacked literally from floor to ceiling. The final step is to leave the lab and go to the place where these millions of objects, real, partial, and fake, were finally delivered. We must now descend into the catacombs. We have now investigated the product from the sacred farms of Section 3 to the factory floor shortcuts of Section 4. We have proven in the sterile light of the lab that the production line was rife with fakes, as we saw in Section 5. But this case file is not complete. We must now follow the supply chain to its final destination. We must go to the warehouse. We must descend into the places where these millions of offerings, real, partial, and counterfeit, were delivered to the gods. The common fact, the one on all the tourist maps, is that Saqqara is a city of the human dead. It is the vast ancient necropolis of Memphis, home to the step pyramid of Djoser and the tombs of Egypt's most powerful nobles. For 3,000 years, it was the most sacred ground on earth, a place for humans to secure their eternity. But hidden just beneath the surface of this famous landscape, another darker necropolis was being excavated, a parallel city of the dead, not for kings, but for cats, dogs, ibis, and baboons. This is where the case file requires a torch. We leave the sun behind. The entrance is a simple, dark square cut into the limestone. The air immediately changes. It becomes cool, still, and impossibly dry. The smell is not of death and decay, but of dust, millennia-old linen, bitumen, and the faint chemical tang of natron salt. This is not a tomb. It is a mine. It is a labyrinth. This is the odd, lesser-known detail that defies the imagination. The sheer, brutalist engineering of these animal catacombs. We are not talking about a few small chambers. We are talking about miles of tunnels. At Tuna El Gabel, the catacombs for Thoth's animals stretch for over 5 miles, a dizzying maze of passages hewn from the bedrock. Here at Saqqara, the catacombs of Anubis are packed with an estimated 8 million canine mummies. The catacombs of Bastet are just as vast. The passages are narrow, low-ceilinged, and oppressive. And on either side, in endless carved niches, are the offerings. They are not buried. They are stacked. This is the moment the beloved pet illusion from Section 1 finally and completely dies. This is not a cemetery. It is a fulfillment center. We see them in the beam of the light, stacked from the floor to the ceiling. A wall of linen-wrapped bundles, 70 million strong, small conical bundles containing ibis. Rough, cat-shaped bundles, small, elaborate sarcophagi for falcons, jars containing mummified snakes and shrews. The priests who took the pilgrim's silver and promised to deliver his prayer to the god did deliver it. They delivered it here, to this suffocating darkness, and placed it on a pile with millions of others. And remember the evidence from our lab in Section 5. We are looking at a physical inventory where perhaps half of the items are fakes. This labyrinth is not just a testament to faith. It is a repository of fraud. A farmer's prayer, a bundle of reeds and mud, is stacked right next to a nobleman's prayer, a genuine gilded cat. In the dark, to the god, were they all the same? Historians still debate whether this was an act of sacred disposal or simply storage? Was a priest required to walk miles into this maze to deposit a single new offering? Or, as the evidence suggests, did they simply fill one gallery, seal it with a stone wall, and begin excavating a new one? The logistics of interring this many mummies are almost as baffling as the logistics of producing them. This was a system operating on a scale that strains our modern comprehension, a machine for processing piety. We have followed the product from the breeding pens to the embalmer's table, from the temple shop to this final terrifying archive. We have seen the shortcuts and the fakes. The entire supply chain is now laid bare. And standing here, in the suffocating silence of 70 million stacked prayers, we are left with the only question that matters, the one that will close this file. Why? The common fact that defines the era of this mummy explosion, the late period from 600 BC onwards, is one of national decline. This was not the Egypt of the pyramid builders. This was a civilization in crisis, a nation suffering a profound loss of confidence. It was repeatedly conquered and occupied by the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally it was absorbed by Rome. The pharaohs were gone, replaced by foreign kings and emperors. It was a time of immense social, political, and religious anxiety. This is the crucial context for our case file, for our case file, for our case file.